The mind has always been a theater of probabilities. Thoughts arrive not as fixed certainties, but as waves, possibilities waiting for attention to collapse them into form. Most people, however, live as though only a narrow spectrum of these probabilities is available. They repeat familiar patterns of thought, tethered to the gravitational pull of past experiences, and call it reality. This is the essence of small thinking, the reduction of infinite possibility to a handful of predictable outcomes, rehearsed daily until they harden into destiny. To understand how to break this habit, one must first step into the paradigm of quantum thinking, where the architecture of thought mirrors the strange, fluid, and infinite nature of the quantum field itself. Quantum thinking does not mean borrowing scientific jargon for motivational speech. It means perceiving the mind as a field of probabilities, where attention is not passive but participatory, and choice is not a mechanical afterthought, but the very mechanism by which potential becomes real. In quantum mechanics, an electron exists in multiple states until observed. In quantum thinking, the self exists in multiple futures until chosen. To think small is to collapse the wave function prematurely, settling for the predictable orbit of past conditions. To think expansively is to hold awareness open long enough to allow improbable, extraordinary possibilities to crystallize. Small thinking is a survival mechanism. It evolved when the nervous system was sculpted by environments where safety required narrowing focus. The brain became adept at spotting threats, recalling past pain, and projecting familiar fears. But survival strategies calcify into cages when carried into environments where possibility has expanded beyond necessity. The modern human, surrounded by abundance of information, opportunity, and creativity, often continues to filter reality through the primal lens of scarcity and fear. Quantum thinking requires a reprogramming of this lens. It requires one to notice the ways thought itself is entangled with the field of possibility, and to deliberately choose expansion over contraction. The first step in breaking the habit of small thinking is awareness of thought as a physical force. Every electrical impulse in the brain produces a magnetic field. Every focus of attention creates a measurable coherence in neural firing. Thought is not invisible. It leaves traces in the body, and it resonates in the field of information beyond the body. When a person continually thinks in small, repetitive ways, "I can't, I'm not enough, that's impossible," the brain wires itself accordingly. Neurons that fire together wire together, and soon the very architecture of the brain reflects the limits of belief. Small thinking becomes not just a psychological habit, but a biological reality. Quantum thinking interrupts this cycle by holding thought as experiment rather than memory. Instead of recycling the past, it asks, what new probability can be entertained? What vision can be held without demanding immediate proof? In doing so, the thinker steps into a role similar to the observer in quantum experiments, where the very act of observation alters the outcome. The mind, when it entertains a new possibility, has already shifted the field of probabilities. Whether or not the outcome manifests immediately is less relevant than the fact that the field has been altered. This is the seed of transformation. Breaking the habit of small thinking requires cultivating familiarity with the unfamiliar. The mind is addicted to predictability, to the comfort of what is already known. It mistrusts the unknown, not realizing that everything extraordinary lives there. Consider how many great discoveries in history emerge from those willing to think beyond the narrow margins of accepted reality. Nikola Tesla envisioned wireless energy when others were still chaining electricity with copper wires. Albert Einstein imagined riding a beam of light and dismantled centuries of classical physics. Martin Luther King Jr. dared to articulate a dream that seemed impossible against the weight of history. All of these figures accessed a form of quantum thinking, not confined to the evidence of the past, but attuned to the probabilities of the future. To cultivate quantum thinking in daily life, one must first dismantle the invisible architecture of smallness. This architecture is built of language, identity, and expectation. Language matters. Every I am statement cements a definition. To continually declare I am unlucky, I am poor, I am anxious, is to collapse infinite probability into a narrow, suffocating identity. Quantum thinking requires one to speak as though possibility is alive. I am becoming, I am expanding, I am open, are statements that keep the wave function uncollapsed, that allow reality to keep breathing into new forms. Identity is the second pillar of smallness. Most people define themselves by memory, by what they have been rather than what they are becoming. They wear their past like armor, repeating the same narratives until the future has no choice but to mimic them. Quantum thinking sees identity as fluid, a pattern of probability that can be shifted with intention. The self is not a fixed point, but a dynamic constellation, always rearranging. To break small thinking is to refuse to be trapped by memory, and instead to claim the freedom to reassemble the constellation. Expectation is the third barrier. Expectation is memory projected forward. When someone expects failure, it is usually because they have failed before. But expectation acts as a filter, causing the mind to notice evidence that confirms it while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. In this way, expectation becomes self-fulfilling. To break free, one must cultivate expectancy instead of expectation. Expectation demands the future look like the past. Expectancy opens to the possibility that the future could surprise. The difference is subtle but profound. Quantum thinking is not naive optimism. It does not deny the existence of difficulty or pain. Rather, it reframes them as data points in a field of infinite potential, rather than determinants of absolute reality. Just as particles fluctuate between states until observed, situations fluctuate between meanings until interpreted. Small thinking interprets difficulty as proof of limitation. Quantum thinking interprets difficulty as temporary turbulence in a larger field of becoming. The practice of quantum thinking requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires training the nervous system to relax into the unknown. Meditation, visualization, breath work, and even physical movement can all be used to disrupt the rigidity of small thinking. When the body is calm, the mind is free to entertain possibilities it would otherwise reject. When the body is tense, the mind contracts. Breaking the habit of small thinking, therefore, is as much about regulating physiology as it is about generating new thoughts. Another powerful technique is deliberate exposure to expanded environments. Just as the brain wires itself through repeated thought, it also wires itself through sensory experience. To continually inhabit environments that mirror limitation, uninspiring spaces, repetitive routines, closed social circles, is to reinforce small thinking. To break free, one must seek out environments that expand the imagination. Art, nature, architecture, conversation with visionaries, literature that disrupts certainty. Each of these becomes a quantum nudge, reminding the nervous system that more is possible than the familiar. Imagination is the central tool. Imagination is not fantasy. It is the laboratory where probabilities are tested before collapsing into reality. Every invention, every revolution, every act of transformation began first as imagination. To reclaim imagination is to reclaim quantum agency. Small thinking dismisses imagination as childish or impractical. Quantum thinking recognizes it as the most practical force available, because it is the only place where the future can be rehearsed before it arrives. The deeper one explores quantum thinking, the clearer it becomes that smallness is not natural. It is trained. Children are born as natural quantum thinkers. They see the world as fluid, their identities as playful, their possibilities as limitless. They do not yet know how to collapse their futures into predictable repetitions, but culture trains them. Education rewards predictability over imagination. Society punishes deviation from expectation. Families, often unconsciously, pass down the limitations of previous generations. Small thinking is inherited, not innate. To break it is to return to something original, something the mind once knew before it was narrowed by fear and conformity. The habit of small thinking can also be understood as entanglement with collective consciousness. Human beings are not isolated observers. They are nodes in a network of thought, feeling, and belief. When the collective is saturated with fear, individuals often find themselves resonating with it without realizing. Breaking small thinking, therefore, requires not only personal practice, but also conscious disentanglement from collective limitation. This can be as simple as limiting exposure to media that amplifies fear, or as profound as cultivating communities committed to expanded thought. Every mind that chooses quantum thinking contributes to the emergence of a collective field where larger possibilities can stabilize. At its core, quantum thinking is a practice of courage. It asks one to step beyond the edges of certainty into the vibrational wilderness of possibility. It asks one to live as though the extraordinary is not only possible, but inevitable, provided attention continues to align with it. It asks one to interrupt the inertia of repetition and to claim the role of observer-creator. Small thinking collapses the world prematurely. Quantum thinking keeps the field alive. The architecture of thought is often invisible to the thinker. Most people assume they're thinking freely, when in truth their minds are structured by grooves carved long ago. Habits of thought are like riverbeds. Once water has flowed in one direction long enough, it carves a channel that becomes difficult to escape. Small thinking is nothing more than the repetition of these narrow channels. It does not feel like choice, it feels like reality. Quantum thinking requires the courage to step outside these grooves, to redirect the river of attention into fields where no channel yet exists. The brain resists this at first. Neuroplasticity allows for new wiring, but it demands effort. Thinking new thoughts feels uncomfortable, not because they are wrong, but because they are unfamiliar. The nervous system interprets unfamiliarity as threat, triggering resistance. This is why most people retreat to small thinking. Not because it is preferable, but because it feels safer. To break this habit, one must become comfortable with discomfort, recognizing it as evidence of expansion rather than danger. One method for cultivating this comfort is the practice of quantum pause. In moments when small thoughts arise, automatic doubts, fears, or limitations, one can pause before reacting. This pause is not passive. It is an active opening of space, a refusal to collapse the wave function too quickly. In that pause, the mind can ask, what else is possible here? What thought would expand rather than contract? The pause interrupts the habitual firing of neurons, allowing the brain to consider probabilities it would normally ignore. Over time, this practice rewires the channels, making expansion more familiar than contraction. Another way to dissolve small thinking is to shift the scale of perspective. Small thoughts thrive when one's gaze is trapped in the microcosm of immediate circumstance. A bill arrives in the mail, and the mind contracts around scarcity. A relationship conflict emerges, and the mind collapses into stories of inadequacy. But when perspective expands to the macrocosm, the smallness is recontextualized. Looking at the night sky, contemplating the vastness of galaxies, remembering the billions of years that preceded this moment. All of this dilates the field of thought. What seemed catastrophic in the small frame becomes insignificant in the large. Quantum thinking continually shifts between scales, refusing to let the mind remain trapped in the prison of immediacy. Consider the quantum truth that particles at great distances remain entangled, influencing one another instantly. If the universe is structured this way at its most fundamental level, then the idea that one is isolated, powerless, or insignificant becomes untenable. Small thinking thrives on the illusion of separation. that one's life is disconnected from the whole, that one's choices ripple only within the confines of one's skin. Quantum thinking dissolves this illusion. It recognizes entanglement as a principle of existence, which means that every thought, every intention, every act of awareness reverberates across the field of being. To think small, then, is not just a personal limitation. It is a withdrawal from one's role in the cosmic web. To think expansively is to accept responsibility for participating in creation itself. The mechanics of small thinking often hide in language that appears rational. People say, "I'm just being realistic." They dismiss expansive visions as impractical or naive. But realism, in most cases, is simply the codification of past patterns. What people call realistic is often nothing more than the statistical average of what has already happened. Yet history is filled with examples where the improbable became reality precisely because someone refused to be realistic. Flight was unrealistic until the Wright brothers lifted into the sky. Moon landings were unrealistic until rockets carried human beings across the void. Quantum thinking insists that reality is not a fixed template to be adapted to, but a mutable field to be shaped. Small thinking is also fueled by the addiction to certainty. Certainty feels safe. The mind craves predictions, guarantees, the assurance of outcomes. But certainty is the antithesis of quantum reality, where uncertainty is not a flaw but a feature. In the quantum field, uncertainty is what allows for multiple probabilities to exist. Without it, novelty could not arise. To break the habit of small thinking, one must befriend uncertainty, not as chaos, but as possibility. Uncertainty is the open sky into which the future can fly. To demand certainty is to clip its wings. The practice of breaking small thinking, therefore, involves a radical shift in relationship to time. Small thinking sees the future as nothing more than an extension of the past. Quantum thinking sees the future as a field of potential that can diverge radically from past patterns. The past is data, not destiny. To believe otherwise is to imprison oneself in repetition. The present moment, then, is not the echo of the past, but the point of choice. Each moment offers the opportunity to collapse the wave function into a different future. Awareness of this transforms the present into sacred ground. Visualization is a tool that makes this process tangible. When a mind rehearses a possibility vividly enough, the brain begins to wire as though it is already occurring. Studies in neuroscience have shown that imagined practice activates many of the same neural circuits as physical practice. This means imagination is not idle, it is rehearsal. When one visualizes an expansive reality, the brain begins to build the architecture for it, preparing the nervous system to embody it. Small thinking resists visualization, dismissing it as fantasy. Quantum thinking embraces it as blueprint. The habit of small thinking is further reinforced by comparison. The mind looks outward, measuring itself against others, and concludes that its possibilities are limited to what it sees reflected. If others have not done it, it must not be possible. But this ignores the fact that every innovation is unprecedented until it occurs. The first person to walk upright, the first to carve tools, the first to speak language, none of these had models to compare to. They were anomalies, wave functions collapsed into improbable form. To break the habit of small thinking, one must abandon comparison as a metric of possibility. Faith is another word that often enters this conversation, but not in its conventional sense. Faith, in the context of quantum thinking, is not blind belief in dogma. It is the willingness to act in alignment with possibilities that are not yet visible. It is the recognition that the invisible is not unreal. It is simply unmanifested. To act without faith is to remain confined to what is already visible, which guarantees repetition. To act with faith is to invite the invisible to become visible. This is not mysticism. It is the mechanics of probability. Breaking small thinking also requires an honest confrontation with fear. Fear is the gravity that pulls thought back into narrow orbits. Most fear is not about actual danger, but about imagined loss. Loss of identity, loss of control, loss of belonging. To transcend small thinking, one must learn to move with fear rather than be paralyzed by it. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that possibility matters more. Quantum thinking frames fear as evidence of the edge of expansion. Whenever fear arises, it signals that one is stepping beyond the known into the quantum unknown. Instead of retreating, one can use fear as a compass, pointing toward growth. The habit of small thinking is not easily broken because it is reinforced by entire cultural systems. Societies often reward conformity, punish deviation, and uphold norms that keep individuals within predictable ranges of behavior. Schools teach children to memorize facts rather than to imagine futures. Workplaces value productivity within existing structures rather than visionary disruption. Media saturates attention with fear, scarcity, and limitation. To break free, one must become subversive, not in destructive ways, but in the quiet rebellion of thought. Choosing to imagine more, to believe in more, to expect more, is itself a revolutionary act. At the deepest level, breaking small thinking is an act of remembering. It is remembering that thought is creative, that reality is participatory, that identity is fluid, and that the universe itself is alive with probabilities waiting for the courage of attention. It is remembering that every human being is not merely a passenger in reality, but a co-creator of it. The habit of small thinking forgets this. Quantum thinking remembers. The transformation from small thinking to quantum thinking is not a sudden event, but a gradual unfolding, like the opening of a flower toward light. At first, the petals resist, curled inward from years of contraction. But with patience, with consistent attention to possibility, the mind begins to unfurl. Each new thought of expansion becomes a ray of light coaxing the petals wider, until what was once closed becomes radiant. The challenge is persistence. The inertia of small thinking is powerful. Decades of neural wiring, cultural conditioning, and personal history cannot be dissolved in a single insight. Insight is the spark, but discipline is the fire. This discipline is not about rigid control, but about devotion. Devotion to remembering that the quantum field always offers more than the past suggests. To practice quantum thinking daily is to train the mind to dwell in this remembrance, to return again and again whenever contraction occurs. One effective approach is to create deliberate thought experiments. Just as scientists design experiments to test hypotheses, the mind can design scenarios that stretch imagination. For instance, one might ask, what would it look like if resources were unlimited? How would I live if fear were irrelevant? Who would I become if identity were not tethered to memory? These questions are not asked for immediate answers. They are asked to stimulate the neural circuitry of expansion. Each question cracks open a doorway to probabilities that small thinking cannot conceive. Over time, these doorways widen until the mind naturally gravitates toward them. Another practice is reframing obstacles as portals. Small thinking interprets obstacles as barriers, proof that expansion is unrealistic. Quantum thinking interprets obstacles as thresholds. They're not signals to stop, but invitations to transcend. When a situation seems immovable, the mind can ask, what perspective am I not seeing? What hidden possibility lies within this resistance? Often, the very obstacle that appears to limit is the catalyst that forces innovation. Just as pressure transforms coal into diamond, resistance transforms the mind into brilliance, if one allows it. To live this way requires humility, because quantum thinking demands letting go of certainty. The ego clings to knowing, to being right, to defining reality in ways that confirm its identity. But the quantum field does not bend to ego's desire for control. It bends to openness. The most expansive thinkers in history were those willing to admit they did not know, and in that not knowing, they allowed new knowledge to emerge. To break the habit of small thinking is to become comfortable with mystery. Mystery is not a void to be feared, but a womb to be entered. Creativity is the natural byproduct of this posture. When a mind is no longer bound by the rigidity of small thinking, creativity flows spontaneously. Ideas appear unbidden. Connections form where none existed before. Solutions emerge without effort. This is not magic, it is coherence. In neuroscience, coherence describes the synchronization of brain waves when the mind is aligned. In quantum thinking, coherence arises when the mind aligns with possibility rather than limitation. The whole system, neural, emotional, energetic, begins to resonate at higher frequencies, generating creativity as naturally as lungs generate breath. Breaking small thinking also transforms relationships. Smallness often manifests as comparison, judgment, or envy. Expansion dissolves these because it sees others not as threats, but as co-creators. If reality is a field of probabilities, then the success of another does not diminish one's own. It expands the field for all. In this view, relationships become collaborations in possibility rather than competitions for scarcity. One person's expansion becomes an invitation for another's. Communities built on this principle generate collective coherence, amplifying possibilities beyond what any individual could create alone. The role of gratitude in this process is profound. Gratitude is not merely appreciation for what is. It is recognition of the field itself. When one practices gratitude, the nervous system shifts from contraction to openness. The brain releases dopamine and serotonin, hormones that reinforce expansion. Gratitude, then, is both an emotional and a biological strategy for breaking small thinking. It reminds the mind that abundance already exists, and in doing so, primes it to perceive more. A grateful mind cannot remain small, because gratitude itself is an act of expansion. The physiology of small thinking is also worth noting. When the mind contracts into fear or limitation, the body follows. The stress response activates. Cortisol floods the bloodstream. Heart rate accelerates. Muscles tighten. This state narrows perception, making it difficult to see beyond immediate threat. Conversely, when a mind expands, the body relaxes. Parasympathetic activation allows for repair, growth, and creativity. The body becomes an ally of possibility. This is why practices that regulate the body, breath work, meditation, movement, rest, are essential companions to quantum thinking. They prepare the vessel for expansion. In many ways, quantum thinking can be described as a shift from linear to nonlinear perception. Small thinking is linear. It sees cause and effect in straight lines, bound by past precedent. Quantum thinking is nonlinear. It sees networks, leaps, and synchronicities. It recognizes that small changes in thought can ripple into vast differences in outcome, that improbable events can collapse into reality without linear explanation. This is not irrationality. It is recognition that reality is not bound by human concepts of order. To think quantum is to allow for surprise, for leaps, for outcomes that defy logic yet make perfect sense in retrospect. This shift also transforms the way one approaches time. Small thinking treats time as a conveyor belt, carrying the self from past to future in predictable sequence. Quantum thinking treats time as a field, where past, present, and future are entangled. What one imagines now reverberates backward and forward, altering the texture of both memory and destiny. This is why changing one's narrative about the past can liberate the future. The past is not fixed. It is continually reinterpreted by the present observer. By seeing past experiences not as prisons, but as lessons, one alters their gravitational pull. The future becomes lighter, more open, more malleable. Ultimately, breaking the habit of small thinking is about sovereignty. Small thinking surrenders sovereignty to circumstance, to history, to fear, to the opinions of others. Quantum thinking reclaims sovereignty by recognizing that the true seat of power is attention. Where attention goes, energy flows. Where energy flows, reality organizes. Sovereignty is not about controlling every outcome. It is about choosing where to place attention again and again until the improbable becomes inevitable. The invitation of quantum thinking is radical, yet simple. To live as though reality is more fluid than it appears, to treat thought as creative rather than reflective, to expand into probabilities rather than contract into certainties. It does not deny the challenges of life, but insists that even challenges are raw material for transformation. It does not dismiss the past, but refuses to let the past dictate the future. It does not erase fear, but reframes it as evidence of growth. Above all, it does not shrink the self into insignificance, but recognizes the self as entangled with the very fabric of existence. In this recognition, small thinking dissolves. The grooves of repetition soften, the walls of limitation crack, the sky of possibility opens. What remains is a mind attuned to the quantum nature of reality, fluid, expansive, alive. To break the habit of small thinking is to remember that the universe itself is abundant with probabilities, and that the greatest act of power is simply to choose among them. To understand the depth of breaking free from small thinking, one must go beyond the mechanics of the brain, the habits of language, and the constraints of culture. At its deepest core, small thinking is a metaphysical contraction, a forgetting of the vast intelligence that animates existence itself. It is the mind narrowing its gaze to a single corridor and mistaking that corridor for the whole of reality. Quantum thinking is the act of widening the gaze, remembering that life is not a hallway, but a universe, infinite in dimensions, possibilities, and expressions. When one begins to live in this way, the world itself responds differently. Opportunities that once seemed invisible begin to appear, not because they were not there before, but because perception was too narrow to notice them. Relationships shift as those aligned with limitation fall away, and those aligned with expansion are magnetized. Synchronicities multiply, those uncanny events where inner thought and outer world align in improbable ways. What was once dismissed as coincidence becomes recognized as coherence. This is the universe speaking back, responding to thought as co-creator rather than spectator. It is here that one begins to see the spiritual dimension of quantum thinking. While rooted in principles reflected in physics and neuroscience, its implications extend into the realm of consciousness itself. Small thinking holds that consciousness is an accident of matter, a byproduct of the brain. Quantum thinking dares to suggest the opposite, that matter itself may be the byproduct of consciousness. If this is true, then thought is not a whisper in the dark, but the light from which darkness is defined. To think small, then, is not merely a personal failure of imagination, but a cosmic denial of one's own creative essence. To embody quantum thinking requires surrender as much as effort. The effort is in training the mind away from contraction, in choosing expansion repeatedly until it becomes natural. The surrender is in recognizing that one does not control the field, only participates in it. The universe is not a machine to be dominated, but a living intelligence to be harmonized with. When attention, emotion, and action align with expansion, the field responds not through force but through flow. Life begins to feel less like pushing against stone and more like being carried by current. This is the paradox. One breaks the habit of small thinking not by straining harder, but by loosening the grip of control and allowing the larger intelligence to move through. What emerges from this practice is a profound sense of freedom. Freedom not defined by external circumstance, but by internal orientation. A person can be in the same job, the same relationship, the same city, and yet live entirely differently once small thinking has been dissolved. The external may remain constant for a time, but the internal reconfiguration transforms the experience. Eventually, The external does shift because reality mirrors the expanded mind. But even before that, freedom has already been claimed because freedom is not what happens. It is how one thinks about what happens. Breaking the habit of small thinking also alters one's sense of purpose. Smallness reduces purpose to survival, achievement, or approval. Expansion reveals purpose as participation in the unfolding of possibility itself. Each person becomes not merely a consumer of reality, but a contributor to it. Purpose is not something to be discovered out there, but something to be expressed in here. The question is no longer, what can I get from life? But what can life express through me if I refuse to think small? This shift ignites passion, not as fleeting excitement, but as enduring fire. Passion becomes the natural state of an expanded mind. The final step in breaking free is integration. Expansion must not remain confined to moments of meditation or flashes of inspiration. It must permeate the ordinary. Quantum thinking is not reserved for visionaries or mystics. It is the natural state of anyone willing to think beyond the narrow grooves of habit. It expresses itself in how one eats, how one speaks, how one works, how one loves. To treat each act as an opportunity for expansion is to dissolve smallness at the root. Washing dishes becomes a meditation on presence. A conversation becomes a laboratory of connection. A walk becomes an exploration of infinity underfoot. Expansion is not somewhere else. It is here, waiting in every moment for recognition. In the end, breaking the habit of small thinking is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about remembering that one already is. The atoms in the body were forged in stars. The consciousness animating the mind is entangled with the fabric of the cosmos. To think small is to forget this. To think quantum is to remember. And in remembering, to reclaim the vastness that has always been available. The habit of small thinking will always whisper. It will whisper fear, doubt, and limitation. But once quantum thinking has been tasted, those whispers lose their power. They become background noise against the resonance of expansion. The choice is always present, to collapse into contraction or to open into possibility. Each thought is a fork in the road, each moment an invitation. To live quantumly is to choose the open road again and again, until the habit of small thinking dissolves entirely, leaving only the radiant unfolding of infinite possibility.